There's a moment, and I've seen it happen more times than I can count now, working 3 rotations at Threshold Station Kale 7, where an alien soldier decides he's already won a fight before it started. You can see it in the way they carry themselves. The shoulders drop, the mandibles loosen. Whatever passes for a smirk on their species crosses their face like a slow tide coming in. They look at the human across from them and they think, soft, small. No claws, no natural armor, no venom sacs. This will take maybe 4 seconds. I want you to remember that moment. Hold it in your mind. Because what happened in Bay 19 of Kale 7, that rotation, between senior auxiliary combatant Vorath Ka of the Gelan Collective and a 26-year-old girl from a little farming town in northern Montana named Corporal Sira Voss. Well, it changed the way a lot of people in this station thought about Deathworlders. Permanently. Let me back up. Threshold Station Kale 7 sits in a stretch of space that doesn't belong to anyone, which means in practice it belongs to everyone, and the arguing never quite stops. It's positioned at the intersection of 3 trade corridors, the Kel Passage, the long arm of Rethais, and a newer route that the Shenari opened up about 40 years ago that doesn't have a formal name yet. Just a navigation designation that translates roughly to the quick way through the dust. The station is big, maybe 40,000 beings of various species on any given cycle, split between permanent crew, transient traders, diplomats, military liaisons, and the usual dense underworld of people who don't want their documentation looked at too carefully. It's not a beautiful place. I want to be honest about that. The docking rings smell like 3 kinds of fuel and 2 kinds of biological waste product that I've never fully identified. The corridors in the lower rings are permanently slightly too warm because the thermal regulation in that section failed 6 years ago, and the parts to fix it properly haven't arrived yet. The lighting in sections see-through G flickers in a way that gives certain photosensitive species migraines, and there's an ongoing diplomatic incident about it that has now outlasted 2 station commanders. But it's alive. That's the word I always come back to. Kale 7 is alive in the way that markets and crossroads and places where many different kinds of people collide are alive, loud and unpredictable and full of small dramas that could tip either way. I run the observation logs for the lower security tier. Think of it like being a librarian of incidents. I don't prevent them, I document them, I file the reports, I make sure the right authorities see the right information. I've been doing it for 6 years. I've seen a lot of things. What happened in Bay 19 is the one I get asked about most. The Gelan Collective had sent a delegation to Kale 7 about 3 months before the incident. Trade negotiations. The Collective wanted access to the Shenari corridor. The Shenari wanted certain mineral processing rights in Gelan space. And everyone wanted humans to stop being quite so aggressively good at moving cargo through disputed regions without paying the corridor fees that the Gelan had decided unilaterally were now a thing. The Gelan are, and I say this as a professional who is supposed to maintain neutral language in all documentation, difficult. That's the diplomatic word. The less diplomatic word, which I have heard from Shenari traders and collective representatives and 3 separate human commanders in my time here, is exhausting. They are hierarchical in a way that makes most other hierarchical species look relaxed. Everything, and I mean everything, is about rank and demonstration of superiority. The food they eat is ranked. The air filtration in their quarters is calibrated to a specific atmospheric composition that signals their caste level. They walk in a particular order when moving in groups, and there is an entire sub-language of physical positioning that communicates social standing without a single word being spoken. They are also, by most objective measures, physically formidable. Gelan adults average about 2.5 meters tall, with a bilateral limb structure that gives them 4 functional arms, 2 primary, 2 secondary, and a skeletal density roughly double what you'd find in a standard species. They have redundant cardiovascular systems, enhanced pain suppression, and natural body armor in the form of a chitinous plating along the back and shoulders that can absorb significant impact. They're auxiliary combatants, which is the Collective's term for their military-adjacent security personnel, are selected for size and strength above those already impressive averages. Vorath Ka was one of their best. He had a service record that the Gelan delegation had, somewhat unusually, allowed to be shared with station security during the liaison briefings. They do that sometimes, it's a status display. Look at our warrior. See what we bring to the table. Voroth Ka stood just under 3 meters, had demonstrated combat effectiveness against 4 separate species in live engagement scenarios, and had a particular history of what the Gelan called rank correction, the practice of physically demonstrating dominance over beings who had failed to show appropriate deference. In other words, he liked to pick fights with people he thought were beneath him, and he was very good at winning them. The humans on Kale 7 at that time were a small contingent, maybe 30 personnel total, a mix of diplomatic staff, technical advisors, and a 6-person security detail whose official role was to protect the human diplomatic team, but whose practical role was somewhat broader. They were under the command of Major Red Asuna, who was one of those quiet people who only speaks when they have something worth saying, and who I had come to genuinely respect over the 2 years he'd been stationed here. Sira Voss was his junior NCO. She'd been on the station about 8 months. She was, and this is me trying to be precise, not poetic, unremarkable in appearance, medium height. Lean build, brown hair kept tight to regulation, the kind of face that doesn't immediately tell you anything, which in my experience is often more interesting than the kind that does. She was from Montana, as I said. She'd grown up on a cattle operation of several thousand acres, which in practice means she'd spent her childhood doing physical labor in altitude and cold and periodic genuine danger from both the landscape and the animals. She'd done 2 years at a university, dropped out, enlisted, done a tour in a conflict zone on Earth's southern continent, and ended up here through the kind of circuitous military path that produces people who are competent in ways that don't always show up on their files. I'd spoken to her a few times during my rounds. She was quiet, thoughtful. She had a habit of asking questions that were more specific than you'd expect, like she was always triangulating toward some precise understanding she was working to build. She did not look like someone who could stop a 3-meter armored alien combatant with a single counter. That was, as it turned out, somewhat relevant to how everything unfolded. The incident began, as many incidents at Kale 7 begin, in the corridor outside the secondary market ring. Bay 19 is technically a maintenance staging area, but it sits adjacent to the market corridor, and it's become an informal gathering place, the kind of space that stations accumulate over time, benches that someone dragged in informally, a food vendor who set up without proper clearance, and has been there long enough that formalizing them seems more trouble than it's worth. A water feature that one of the Shinari cultural liaisons installed as a goodwill gesture, and that nobody has removed despite it not being entirely up to code. There's always people there, beings, I should say, all kinds. That particular cycle, Voroth Ka had been, and this is documented in about 4 different observation logs, not just mine, in a progressively deteriorating mood. The trade negotiations had not gone well that morning. The Gelan delegation had made a proposal that the Shinari representatives had rejected with what one of my colleagues described as the most diplomatically worded contempt I have ever witnessed in 20 years of documenting this station. The Gelan do not handle rejection well at the best of times. They handle it much worse when they believe the rejection comes from a species they consider to be below them. Which, to be clear, is most species. The Gelan are not modest about their place in the galactic order as they understand it. Voroth Ka had apparently been dismissed from the negotiation chamber after making a comment that the translation systems had rendered, somewhat diplomatically, as questioning the reproductive decisions of the lead Shinari negotiator. He'd been in the market corridor for about 40 minutes at that point, and 2 separate vendor complaints had already been filed. He came into Bay 19 from the East Passage, which is the wider one that can accommodate beings of larger stature. His 2 secondary guards, because Gelan combatants of his rank travel with an entourage, were a respectful distance behind him. The bay was moderately occupied. A group of Shinari traders talking quietly near the water feature, a couple of Keithrani maintenance workers eating a meal, and Sira Voss, who was sitting on one of the informal benches doing what appeared to be administrative work on a small portable terminal. She was alone, which I note not because it's surprising human security personnel on Kale 7 routinely moved solo during off-duty periods in the market sections, but because it's relevant to what Voroth Ka apparently decided when he saw her. The observation footage from Bay 19 is good. We upgraded the sensors in that section after an incident involving a Keith-Ronnie mechanical dispute about 14 months ago. I've watched the relevant segment many times since, and what strikes me each time is how deliberate it is. Vorith Ka doesn't stumble into the confrontation. He walks towards Sira Voss in a direct line, with the kind of intentionality that in Gellan body language is itself a dominance display. Direct approach is a signal, because in their hierarchy lower-ranking beings move to make way. He's expecting her to look up, see him coming, and move. Get out of the area. Defer. That would be the correct response by his cultural framework. Sira Voss looks up. She clocks him, you can see it in the camera feed, the slight adjustment of posture that indicates attention, and then she looks back at her terminal. She doesn't move. This is the moment. This is where, if you watch the footage carefully, you can see Vorith Ka's whole demeanor change. The loose, slightly contemptuous walk gets a different quality to it. His secondary guard shift positions slightly. Something in the dynamic of the scene crystallizes into something harder. He stops approximately 1.5 meters in front of her. He says something. The bay's audio capture isn't perfect at that range. It's ambient recording, not directional, but the translation system picks up the gist of it from fragmentary audio data. It's essentially a demand that she vacate the space. Phrased in the way that Gellan combatants phrase demands, which is to say, it's technically phrased as an option in the same way that jumping off a cliff is technically an option. Sira Voss says something back. The translation system catches this one more clearly, and I've included it verbatim in the incident report. She says, I'm in the middle of something. Give me about 10 minutes. I need to explain something about Gellan physiology and combat culture before I go further, because it matters for understanding what happens next. The Gellan's forearm structure gives them a fighting style that is, by most assessments, extremely difficult to counter. Their primary arms are the powerful ones, long reach, tremendous grip strength, capable of generating force that can crack the hull plating on standard cargo containers. Their secondary arms are faster and more precise. In a combat encounter, a Gellan combatant typically uses the primary arms for controlling distance and generating power, while the secondary arms are used for faster, more targeted strikes. Their standard combat initiation is what their training doctrine calls the close, a rapid forward movement combined with a grab by one or both primary arms, designed to control the opponent's position and remove their ability to generate counterforce. Once they have a grip, the fight is essentially over for most opponents. The chitinous plating means incoming strikes from a grabbed opponent have minimal effect. The grip strength means escape is almost impossible for most species. Against a human, the calculation by Gellan standards would be trivial. Humans have no natural armor. They have a relatively high pain response compared to several galactic species. They are smaller. One primary arm grab, one controlled throw, dominance established. 4 seconds, as I said. This is what Vorith Ka had in mind. You can see it in the footage, the weight shift onto the balls of his feet before he moves, the slight rotation of the primary shoulders that precedes the close. Every trained observer in security who has watched this footage recognizes it. What he did not have in mind, and what he demonstrably did not know, is what Sira Voss had been doing with her winters since she was 12 years old. The Voss family ran cattle, but they also ran a small training operation on the side. Sira Voss's grandmother had been a competitive grappler. Her mother had trained to a high level in a Japanese martial discipline that I will not attempt to spell here, but whose principles center on using an opponent's force and mass against them. Sira had grown up on mats and in cold barns, learning how bodies move and how to interfere with that movement at precisely the right moments. She had also, and this is in her military record, spent 2 years competing in mixed combat disciplines during her service. She placed 3rd at a regional competition. She was specifically noted by her training evaluators for something that translates in military language as exceptional kinesthetic anticipation, the ability to read where a body is going to be a fraction of a second before it gets there. She'd also trained with alien combat specialists during her time in the field. Not many, the opportunities are limited, but enough. She knew, or had made it her business to know, how several galactic species initiated physical confrontations. She knew the Gellan close. The footage shows this with almost uncomfortable clarity. Vorith Ka moves, He is fast, and I want to give him that because 3 meters of Gelan combatant moving with full intent is genuinely fast. He covers the 1.5 meters between them in something less than a second. His left primary arm extends toward her upper body, fingers spreading for the grip. Sira Voss moves at what appears, watching the footage to be the same moment. Not after, with. She drops her terminal with her right hand, her weight shifts almost imperceptibly onto her left foot, and she does something that is extremely hard to describe in words and much easier to see. She takes the momentum of his incoming grab and she doesn't fight it. She's not strong enough to fight it. That's not the point. She redirects it. She catches his primary arm at the wrist with both her hands, which requires her to move into the grab, toward him, which is the opposite of what most beings do and which is why it works, and she pivots. Her body turns. She drops her center of gravity in the same motion, and she uses the pivot to apply Voroth Ka's own considerable forward momentum against a joint in his primary arm that the Gelan anatomy has, as it turns out, in roughly the same place as a human elbow. It is a joint lock, a basic one in the sense that the principle is simple. The execution is not basic. The execution requires knowing exactly how much pressure to apply, at what angle, at what speed, and it requires the kind of reflex speed that you do not acquire without years of doing it until it is not a thought but a reflex. Voroth Ka goes down. Not slowly, not gracefully. His forward momentum, which was substantial, goes into the lock, and the lock redirects it, and 3 meters of armored alien combatant hits the floor of Bay 19 with an impact that is audible in the footage as a concussive boom that makes several nearby beings flinch visibly. He is face down. His primary arm is in an angle it was not designed to be in. Sira Voss is standing above him, still holding the wrist, and she is not even particularly out of breath. The entire sequence takes, by my frame-by-frame analysis of the footage, approximately 2.3 seconds. What happens in the next 10 seconds is almost as remarkable as the fall itself. Bay 19 goes completely silent. The Shinari traders stop talking. The Keithrani maintenance workers stop eating. Voroth Ka's 2 secondary guards, who were positioned 4 meters back, are frozen in what I can only describe as genuine processing failure. They were expecting to watch their combatant dominate a small human, and what they are seeing does not compute. Sira Voss says something, still holding the arm. The audio catches it this time. She says, "I'm going to let go now. I'd recommend staying down for a moment." And then she does. She releases the arm, steps back, picks up her terminal from where she dropped it, and sits back down on the bench. Voroth Ka stays on the floor for approximately 8 seconds. Then he gets up. His primary arm is clearly not functioning correctly. He's holding it at an angle that indicates significant joint distress. He is, by the standards of his species, completely humiliated, floored by a creature that, by Gelan taxonomy, should not have been capable of resisting him at all. He looks at her, she's looking at her terminal. He says something, the audio is unclear, but the body language of his secondary guards suggests it's something along the lines of a threat. And Sira Voss, still looking at her terminal, says, "You can absolutely file a complaint. Security office is in Section B." And then she goes back to whatever she was doing. Voroth Ka leaves Bay 19. His guards follow him. One of them looks back at Sira Voss with an expression that I've had translated by 3 separate xenolinguists, all of whom agree it means approximately. What is that? She filed her own incident report within the hour. It was 4 sentences. It described the encounter as an unprovoked approach, a physical initiation by Voroth Ka, a defensive counter, and a resolution. She used the term minimal intervention, which is technically correct and also, given the footage, the funniest 2 words I have ever read in an official document. Major Asuna reviewed the report, the footage, and Voroth Ka's filed complaint, which characterized the incident as an assault, a position that does not survive contact with approximately 47 seconds of high-resolution observation footage. And then he came to my office. He sat down across from my desk, and he put his hands together and he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How many beings were in Bay 19 when this happened?" I checked my records. 14, sir, plus Voroth Ka's 2 secondary guards. He nodded. "And how many of those 14 do you think are going to tell someone what they saw?" I thought about it. "All of them," I said. He nodded again. Yeah, he said, that's what I figured. He was right. By the next cycle, the story had spread through KL7 with the velocity that only truly remarkable things achieve in a closed community. Stations are like small towns. Information moves fast, and nothing moves faster than information that disrupts people's assumptions about the order of things. The Gelan delegation was furious. Vorith Ka's complaint was pursued through the official channels, and the official channels reviewed the footage, and the Gelan's liaison officer came to my office and spent 40 minutes trying to argue that the footage was somehow misleading, or that there was a cultural context that changed the interpretation. There isn't. A combatant initiates a physical grab on a being who then counters and controls them. The cultural context the Gelan liaison was gesturing toward, that Vorith Ka's rank entitled him to physically assert dominance over lower status beings, is not recognized in KL7 Code of Conduct, which makes sense because if it were, the station would be ungovernable. The complaint was dismissed. Vorith Ka returned to the Gelan delegation's quarters and did not, for the remainder of his time on KL7, approach another human being without formal diplomatic clearance. But here's the part I think about most, and that I've spent a lot of time trying to understand in the months since. About 3 days after the incident, I was doing my rounds in the market corridor, and I happened to pass through Bay 19. Sira Voss was there again, same bench, same terminal. A Shinari trader who I recognized from the group that had been present during the incident stopped as he passed her. He was older, with the kind of weathering that comes from decades on the trade corridors, and he looked at her for a moment with an expression that I couldn't immediately categorize. Then he said something to her. I don't have a recording of it. This was ambient corridor space, not a monitored bay, but I saw it, and I saw her respond, and I saw him nod slowly and move on. I asked her about it later, when I saw her in the commissary. She thought for a moment before she answered, which is her way. He asked me if I'd been scared, she said. I asked what she'd told him. I told him not of him, she said. I told him the scary part was whether I'd gotten the angle right. If I'd been off by a few centimeters, I would have hurt him badly, and that was the thing I didn't want. She picked up her food. He said that was a very strange thing to be scared of, she said. I said, yeah, probably. But I've only got one counter that works on a closed-arm initiation from that angle, and I've never drilled it against a Gelan, so there was a margin for error. She started to walk away, and then she turned back. I'd practiced it on a Torvin trainer back in my service, she said. Similar joint geometry, different weight distribution. I didn't know if it would translate. She paused. It translated. And she went back to her table. I've thought about what she said many times since. The scary part was whether I'd gotten the angle right. The scary part was not the 3-meter armored alien moving toward her with lethal intent. The scary part was precision. The scary part was doing it right. That's not bravery in the way that word usually gets used. It's something more specific. Something that only comes from training so deeply that the fear of failure at the technical level displaces the fear of the physical threat. And maybe that's what Vorith Ka didn't understand, and what the Gelan taxonomy of species weakness doesn't account for. Not the capability, not the fact that humans can do these things, but the relationship to the doing. The fact that a human from a cattle farm in Montana spent years making a joint lock so automatic that when a 3-meter alien came at her, her dominant emotion was, did I get the angle right? The Gelan think soft means weak. They think no natural armor means no protection. They think small means easy. They think they already know how the fight goes before it starts. Bay 19, Section C, Threshold Station KL7. Let the record show what happens when you make that assumption about the girl from the Deathworld. Part 2, The Weight of a Single Moment. 3 weeks after the incident in Bay 19, the one that everyone on KL7 was still talking about in the corridors and the commissary, and in the low voices that people use when they're not sure who might be listening. The Gelan delegation requested what they called a formal clarification, meeting with Major Asuna and his senior staff. It was phrased as a diplomatic discussion. Everyone knew it wasn't. I was present in my capacity as a records officer. There are formal documentation requirements for any meeting between Station Security Command and a visiting delegation's military personnel. I sat at the back of the room with my recording equipment, and I watched. The Gelan delegation sent 3 people. their senior military attaché, a being named Korseth Ran, who was imposing even by Gellan standards. A cultural liaison officer whose name translated roughly to something like Bridge of Understanding, which was either deeply sincere or deeply ironic depending on how the meeting went, and a legal adjudicator from their delegation staff. Major Asuna brought Sira Voss, Lieutenant Commander Priya Nath, who ran the Human Diplomatic Security Detail, and me. Korseth Ran opened the meeting by placing on the table, and I am including this in the official record because it felt significant, a physical document. Paper. Old-style paper, the heavy bonded kind that the Gellan use for formal proceedings. He placed it with both primary hands and then settled back and looked at Major Asuna with the expression of someone who has many things to say and has decided to let the paper say them first. Major Asuna looked at the paper. He didn't touch it. "I see," he said. What the paper said, and I had it translated formally, as is required, was essentially this: that the Gellan Collective was formally protesting the incident in Bay 19 on the grounds that their auxiliary combatant, Voreth Ka, had suffered injury and public humiliation in an encounter with a human subordinate that violated the standards of appropriate engagement recognized by the collective. That this encounter demonstrated a troubling pattern of human behavior aboard Kale 7 that had been escalating, and that the collective was requesting formal disciplinary action against Corporal Sira Voss. There was a secondary document, smaller, that was essentially a medical assessment of Voreth Ka's arm. The joint had been significantly stressed. He would recover fully, but it had required treatment. Korseth Ran looked at Major Asuna and said, in the measured tones of someone speaking through translation systems, "We expect this to be addressed." Major Asuna put his hands on the table. He has very steady hands. I've noticed that about him before. Nothing shakes them. He said, "I've reviewed the footage. I've reviewed Corporal Voss's report. I've reviewed your complaint, and I want to make sure I understand your position correctly." He paused. "You're requesting disciplinary action against a member of my team for defending herself when she was physically approached and grabbed." The cultural liaison officer said, "The situation is more nuanced." "The footage is clear," Major Asuna said. He said it very quietly. The quiet way he says things when the quietness is doing a lot of work. Korseth Ran leaned forward. "The nuance," he said, "is that senior auxiliary combatant Voreth Ka is a decorated military officer of the Gellan Collective. The being he approached is a junior subordinate of. A human being on a station that doesn't recognize the Gellan rank hierarchy as grounds for physical assertion," Major Asuna said, still quiet. "On a station where the code of conduct makes no provision for what you're describing." Korseth Ran was quiet for a moment. Major Asuna let the quiet sit. Then Korseth Ran said, "We are requesting that she be transferred off-station. We find her presence here to be," he paused, selecting the word with visible care, "provocative. And here is the moment I will remember for the rest of my professional life." Major Asuna didn't answer. He looked at Korseth Ran for a moment, and then he turned to Sira Voss, who was sitting to his left. She had been quiet through the entire meeting, quiet in her specific way, the way that is not nervousness but attention, the way she listens like she's building a structure out of what she hears. Asuna said, "Corporal." She said, "Sir." He said, "Do you have anything you'd like to add?" She looked at Korseth Ran. She looked at the paper on the table. She looked at the legal adjudicator, who was watching her with an expression of what I can only describe as professional wariness. She said, "I'd like to know what the collective would have preferred I do." Korseth Ran said, "The appropriate response to an approach from a superior ranked." "I know what your protocol says," she said, not rudely, just factually. "I'm asking what you expected me to do when someone 3 times my mass reached for me with intent to grab, physically. What was the option you wanted?" There was a silence. "Submit," said Korseth Ran. He said it like it was obvious, like the word was the end of a logical sequence that should have been apparent to anyone. Sira Voss nodded once, the slow, deliberate nod of someone who has just received the exact answer they expected. "With respect," she said, "that's not something I'm capable of." "Capable of?" "It's not a policy statement," she said. "It's a physiological fact. I can't submit to a physical threat and not respond. It doesn't work that way. You train out the freeze response or you train in the counter response, but you don't train a person to just accept being grabbed. Not on a Deathworld, not where I grew up, not with the kind of work I do. She paused. I don't think Vorithka understood that. Korseth Rand stared at her for a long moment. His secondary arms, which the Gellan use for fine expression the way humans use hands and face, moved in a pattern that the cultural liaison officer, Bridge of Understanding, visibly reacted to. The cultural liaison said, quietly, to Korseth Rand in Gellan, not intended for the translation systems, but the systems caught it anyway. She is saying she cannot be taught to be prey. There was another silence. Major Asuna collected the paper from the table, placed it in his folder, and stood up. I'll be filing a formal response to your complaint by end of cycle, he said. The response will be, no action. Corporal Voss performed an appropriate defensive response to an unprovoked physical initiation. She will not be disciplined or transferred. If the collective has further concerns about the conduct of my personnel, they can file through the station's formal grievance process, which I believe you're already familiar with. He looked at Korseth Rand. Is there anything else? There wasn't. The Gellan delegation left. I closed my recording equipment, and I sat for a moment in the empty room, because I am allowed small moments of unprofessionalism in private, and I thought, she cannot be taught to be prey. Part 3, what the station learned. Here is the thing that nobody in the official reports captures, because official reports aren't in the business of capturing it. After Bay 19, something changed on Kale 7. Not dramatically, not overnight. The station didn't suddenly become a different place. The same fuel smell was still in the docking rings. The lighting in Section G still flickered. The same disputes ran in the background of every cycle. The same trade arguments and corridor fee negotiations and diplomatic small-print battles. But something changed. I noticed it first in the commissary, about a week after the meeting with the Gellan delegation. There was a table of Keithrani workers. Keithrani are middle-sized beings, roughly human height but broader, with a bioluminescent stripe along their spines that brightens when they're agitated or excited. They work in the station's maintenance and engineering sections mostly, and they're good at their jobs and generally keep to themselves, and have never caused me any documentation headaches, which I appreciate. Sira Voss came in for the mid-cycle meal and got her food and found an empty table near the window. The window in the commissary looks out at the transit ring, and you can see ships coming and going, which is the best view available anywhere in the station's common areas. And she sat down with her terminal, in her usual way, working while she ate. One of the Keithrani workers looked over at her. Then he said something to the beings at his table. And then, and this is the part, one of them picked up his tray and walked over to her table and sat down across from her. She looked up. He said something. The translation, which I got later from a Keithrani colleague of mine, was, "Is this seat open?" She said it was. And then 2 more Keithrani came over. And then a Shinari trader who I recognized. And then, gradually, a small informal group assembled around Sira Voss's previously solitary table, and the conversation I could see through the commissary window. I wasn't inside, I was passing in the corridor. Looked like the kind of easy, varied conversation that happens when people feel something in common without quite being able to name it. I asked my Keithrani colleague about it later. He told me what they'd been talking about. Vorithka and the Gellan, mostly. The complaint, the meeting, what the Gellan had expected and what had happened instead. They wanted to know if she was afraid, my colleague said. What did she say? She said the only things she's been afraid of since she got here are the thermal regulation failure in Section F. She doesn't like the heat, and a particular docking procedure she had to assist with once that she said felt wrong. I laughed. My Keithrani colleague's bioluminescent stripe brightened, which is the Keithrani equivalent of laughing along. The Keithrani like her, he said. The Shinari do too. There's a thing that certain species do, not humans, but others, where they make sure everyone in the room knows how significant they are before they sit down. You know the thing I mean. I did. I documented enough incidents that started with it. She doesn't do that, he said. She just sits down. The Gellan delegation concluded their trade negotiations 2 weeks later. The outcome was not particularly favorable to them. The Shinari got most of what they wanted. The corridor fee dispute remained unresolved in the humans' favor, which is the outcome that the Gelan delegation had come here to prevent. Whether Bay 19 had anything to do with that outcome is, officially, impossible to say. Negotiations are complex. Many factors contribute to results. Unofficially, I spoke to one of the junior members of the Shinari negotiating team at a social function that I attended in my station liaison capacity, and I asked her, carefully and without quite asking it directly, whether the incident had affected how the Shinari negotiators thought about the balance of the table. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The Gelan came here thinking about what things are worth. We negotiated about what things are worth, but the whole time they were also thinking about," she paused, searching for the right word, "about the order, about who defers to whom, about whether respect has to be given or whether it can be taken." She looked at me. "After Bay 19, she said, they had a harder time making that argument. Major Asuna put in for a commendation for Sierra Voss. It was approved, which was slightly unusual given the diplomatic sensitivity around the incident, and I think speaks to the fact that someone relatively senior in the human diplomatic command reviewed the footage and made the same assessment the rest of us had. The commendation citation, which I have in my files, is formal and brief, and uses the correct administrative language. It notes exceptional composure under provocation and effective defensive response with minimal escalatory effect. The language doesn't capture it. Language usually doesn't. What it was, a person who had spent years learning a specific skill, so thoroughly that it became reflex, facing a moment when that skill mattered and getting the angle right. What it meant, a 3-meter armored alien combatant who had come to this station thinking he understood the hierarchy of the galaxy, leaving with his arm in a treatment brace, and a much more complicated picture of where humans fit in the order of things. What it showed, that soft isn't the same as yielding, that small isn't the same as easy, that the absence of claws or chitin or venom sacs or redundant cardiovascular systems tells you something about a creature's evolutionary context, but nothing about what they have decided to become. Part 4, the longer story. I have been in this work for a long time, long enough to have watched several different species encounter humans for the first time and go through the adjustment that encountering humans seems to require. The first contact reports, the ones that get declassified after long enough, have a pattern. Almost every species, seeing humanity from a distance for the first time, makes the same initial assessment. They look at the biology, the soft tissue, the slow speed, the lack of specialized weaponry, the median lifespan that is unremarkable by galactic standards, and they form a picture. And then they interact with humans, and the picture changes. And they interact more, and it changes more. And somewhere in that process, there is always a moment, a specific moment, different for every species, but always present, where the model breaks. Where the thing they thought was true turns out not to be. For the Gelan, I think Bay 19 might have been that moment, or the beginning of it. Because what Vorith Ka didn't have in his model, what the Gelan taxonomy of species doesn't account for, is the thing that makes humans unusual, and that is hard to put in a biological assessment. Humans are from a Deathworld. I know that word gets used a lot, in a range of contexts with varying degrees of precision. But what it means in the context that matters. Earth is a planet where the things trying to kill you include the atmosphere, the temperature range, the microorganisms, the weather, the terrain, the other animals, and frequently other humans. Earth is a planet where the evolutionary pressure has been, for a very long time, intense. Where the species that survived did so not because they were the biggest or the most armored or the most venomous, but because they were adaptable, inventive, capable of learning. Capable of making a joint lock that works on a Gelan arm from a half-remembered training session on a Torvan combat specialist, done years ago in a cold field facility somewhere, that she then drilled until it was reflex. That's the thing, that's the specific, particular thing. Humans encounter a threat they can't physically match and they don't stop. They study it. They practice. They build the tool that counters the thing. They do it until the doing is automatic, and then they sit on a bench in Bay 19 and wait. Vorith Ka's model had a category for prey. He had a category for equals. He had a category for genuinely dangerous species, the ones with natural weapons he'd been trained to respect. He didn't have a category for a small being from a planet that taught its children, generation after generation, that the only answer to the thing that's going to try to kill you is to get better at surviving it, to study it, To drill the counter until you could do it in your sleep. To sit with the question of did I get the angle right, instead of the question of am I afraid. He doesn't have that category now either. He has a different one. I talked to Sira Voss one more time before she rotated off Kale 7. Her tour ended about 4 months after the incident, and she was reassigned to a posting I don't have clearance to know the details of, which in my experience means it's either very boring or very interesting, and given what I know about her, I have a guess. She was in the market corridor with her kit bag, waiting for her transport. I stopped to say goodbye. We'd had enough exchanges over 8 months that it felt like the right thing to do. She was the same as she'd always been, unhurried. That specific quality of attention she has, present with wherever she is and not straining toward wherever she's going. I told her that the station had been talking about her since Bay 19, that she'd become something of a reference point in how people on Kale 7 thought about certain things. She considered this for a moment. She didn't seem uncomfortable with it, but she didn't seem pleased either. She just turned it over like she was examining it for accuracy. I did a basic defense against a grab, she said. I've been drilling that specific counter since I was 17. Vorith Ka had been drilling his equivalent since he was, whatever age Gelan combatants start training. Yeah, she paused. His counter worked on most things it had ever met. Mine worked on most things I'd ever drilled it on. We just hadn't drilled against each other. Another pause. I got lucky that the joint geometry was close enough. That's not what anyone else on this station thinks happened. She looked at me, then slowly she smiled. Not a big smile, she's not a person of big smiles, but the real kind. I know, she said. I just think they're putting too much on the moment. The moment it was 2 seconds. The work was years. She picked up her kit bag. That's the part that matters, the years. Her transport was called. She walked away without looking back, which is how she does most things. Part 5, what the footage doesn't show. There are 47 seconds of observation footage from Bay 19 that I have watched, at this point, more times than I can accurately count. I have watched it at normal speed, at 1/4 speed, at 1/8 speed. I have watched it with every audio enhancement the systems can provide. I have shared it with colleagues, with analysts, with 2 xenobiologists who were curious about the biomechanics, and with one being who works in the diplomatic corps and who wanted it for what she called contextual education, and I didn't ask further. There's something the footage doesn't show, and I've been thinking about it since the day of the incident. It doesn't show what Sira Voss was thinking in the moment between seeing Vorith Ka begin his approach and beginning her response. 2.3 seconds of footage. Footage is good for what bodies do. It's not good for what happens in the gap between seeing and doing. I've thought about it enough that I finally asked her, in one of the commissary conversations in the weeks after the incident. She thought about it the way she thinks about things, which is without hurrying. I saw him start the close, she said. I recognized it. I'd studied Gelan combat initiation patterns when I was briefed on the delegation. His weight was on his right foot. His primary left arm was extending. She paused. I didn't think a lot of words. You don't at that speed. It was more like I knew where he was going to be. I knew what I needed to do. I just had to get there first. She took a bite of whatever she was eating. The only thing that felt like a thought, she said, was angle, just that one word. Because if I got the angle wrong by more than a few degrees, the lock wouldn't work on his arm. It's a different density than what I trained on. Just angle in the 2 seconds between recognizing the attack and completing the counter. One word, the technical variable, the margin for error. Not he's 3 times my size. Not I don't know for certain this works on a Gelan. Not I'm afraid, just angle. I've thought about that for months. About what it takes to train a human brain, which in many ways is a very frightened piece of biological equipment that has a lot of fear responses built deeply into it from very old evolutionary necessity. I've thought about what it takes to train that brain so thoroughly that in the moment of genuine physical threat, the thought is angle. Not run, not freeze, not submit. Angled. The Gelan think about species in terms of what they are, what their biology gives them, what their evolutionary history produced. They are not wrong that this is meaningful. Biology is real. Evolutionary history is real. Vorath Ka's arm density and grip strength and redundant cardiovascular system and chitinous plating are real advantages that matter in real situations. But there is something else that is also real. That is the gap between what a creature is and what it decides to become. Humans live in that gap. More than any species I have encountered in this work, humans live in the space between their biological baseline and the ceiling they decide to push toward. They are not the strongest species. They are not the fastest. They are not the most naturally armored or the most inherently dangerous in baseline biological terms. They are the most relentlessly self-improving species I have ever documented. And they do it in the specific, particular, almost stubborn way of beings who grew up on a planet that was genuinely and consistently trying to kill them for a very long time, and who responded to that by saying, "Fine, let me learn the angle." That is the thing the Gellan taxonomy misses. That is the thing Vorath Ka did not account for. That is the thing that put him on the floor of Bay 19, while a woman from Montana sat back down on a bench and picked up her terminal. Part 6, The Ripple. 4 months after Sira Voss transferred off Kale 7, I was in Section B doing my rounds when I passed a Gellan auxiliary officer, one of the lower-ranked ones from the permanent Gellan commercial liaison staff, not from the delegation that had since returned home. He was young, by Gellan standards, with plating that hadn't fully hardened yet, and a bearing that was still finding its settled shape. He was talking to one of the human technical advisors. I slowed my pace, because I'm professionally nosy and I have the authority to be. The conversation was about the joint geometry of Gellan primary arms. The human advisor was explaining, with the kind of patient specificity of someone who has clearly been asked to explain this before, where the vulnerable angles were, and how you would approach a counter if you needed one, and what the principles were that made it work. The young Gellan was listening, with the focused attention of someone taking notes in their head. I finished my pass of Section B and continued my rounds. It is not an exaggeration to say that this was the strangest thing I observed in Bay 19's aftermath. Not the fall itself, not the complaint, not the diplomatic meeting. This, a Gellan auxiliary officer asking a human to teach him where his own arm could be broken. Because he'd seen what happened when someone already knew the answer to that question, and you didn't. The human was happy to explain. That's another thing about humans that consistently surprises people until they've known enough of them. They share. Not always, not universally, there are plenty of human failures to document alongside the remarkable moments. But the knowledge, the specific, technical, practiced knowledge that someone spent years building, they share it. Here's where the joint is. Here's the angle. Here's why it works. Here's how you counter it or how you protect against it. There's something in that. Something that I don't have the right words for, even after 6 years of trying to find the right words for the things I observe on this station. A species that turns the thing that almost beat them into curriculum. That makes the lesson available. That says, here, I know this, take it. I don't know what that Gellan auxiliary officer did with what he learned that afternoon in Section B. I don't know if he drilled it. I don't know if it ever mattered in a practical sense. But he asked, and he was answered. And I think about that sometimes, when I'm filing reports in my office, and the lights in Section G are doing their thing, and the fuel smell is drifting up from the docking rings, and Threshold Station Kale 7 is being its loud, messy, contentious, alive self. I think about what it costs to ask where you're vulnerable, and what it might mean that the species which understood how to flatten you with a single counter is also the species most likely to sit down and explain exactly how they did it. Part 7, Record. For the formal record, because this is, ultimately, a records office, and all of this exists because I document things for a living. Here is the official timeline of what is now referenced internally as the Bay 19 incident. Cycle 7441, Rotation 2, approximately 14:30 station time. Gellan Senior Auxiliary Combatant Vorath Ka entered Bay 19 of Threshold Station Kale 7 secondary market ring. 14:32, contact with human Corporal Sira Voss occurred. 14:32, plus approximately 2.3 seconds, Vorath Ka initiated physical contact. Corporal Voss performed a defensive counter. 14:33, Vorath Ka recovered and exited Bay 19 with his secondary guard. 14:58, Corporal Voss filed an incident report, 4 sentences. That is the formal record. Here is the informal one. A human from a Deathworld, sitting alone on a bench, doing her paperwork, in a space station at the intersection of 3 trade corridors where 40,000 beings of different species live their various lives. A 3-meter armored combatant who came toward her with the absolute certainty that this encounter had already been decided before it began. A 2.3-second sequence that rewrote his certainty, and the certainties of everyone who saw it, and everyone who heard about it from everyone who saw it. And the thought in her head, in the gap between seeing and doing, that was not fear and not doubt but a single technical word. Angled, and the angle was right. And she picked up her terminal and went back to work. End of record, Bay 19 incident, Threshold Station KL7. Filed by Senior Records Officer Damien Toll, Station Security Observation Division. Cross-referenced, Incident Case 7441BN001, Gelen Delegation Complaint 7441GHC004. Addendum Personal. I have been filing these records for 6 years. I will file them for however many more years this station needs someone to do it. I am not a poetic person by profession or temperament. But I believe, for reasons I cannot put in official language, that the most important 2.3 seconds in the recent history of this station's interspecies dynamics were the ones where a young woman from a cattle farm in northern Montana asked herself a single technical question and answered it correctly. She got the angle right. That's the whole story, really. That's all any of it ever comes down to.